On the afternoon of Friday, August 2nd, 1985, passengers were arriving as normal at Delta Airlines gates at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. And they did so in order to board flight 191 that was going to take them over towards Los Angeles with an intermediate stop in Dallas. Waiting outside the gate was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar with registration November 726 Delta Alpha, delivered new to Delta in February of 1979, and it had at this point accumulated just over 19,000 flight hours and nearly 8,400 flight cycles during its more than 6 years of service. Like all L-1011s, it was comfortable, technologically advanced and exceptionally reliable. And investigators would later find no evidence of any unresolved mechanical defects that had any impact on what was soon about to happen. In the cockpit of the aircraft that afternoon sat a quite experienced cockpit crew. The captain was a 57-year-old Delta veteran with 29,300 hours of total experience, of which 3,000 were on the L-1011. And his colleagues constantly described him as capable and meticulous, someone who refused to take shortcuts even when other pilots would. Beside him sat the 42-year-old first officer, a former US Navy aviator with 6,500 hours of flying experience, of which 1,200 had been flown on this type. And he had an equally strong reputation within the airline. In fact, Delta had previously selected him as an L-1011 line check airman, responsible for evaluating other pilots on the aircraft, and captains that he had flown with described his systems knowledge as well above average. On this leg, the first officer would be the pilot flying, with the captain as pilot monitoring, whilst the third person in the flight deck, the flight engineer, another experienced crew member with a total of 6,500 hours, would monitor its systems. Like his colleagues that day, he was regarded as observant, methodical and highly competent, so together these three men represented exactly the sort of crew that passengers hoped would be at the controls. Behind the cockpit, there were eventually a total of 152 passengers and 8 cabin crew members, bringing the total number of souls on board up to 163. Now, after the cabin doors were eventually closed, the big white TriStar pushed back from the gate and departed Fort Lauderdale on schedule for what was expected to be a completely uneventful flight westward. Before departure, the crew had reviewed the weather forecast for their route and destination and had seen that thunderstorms were expected along portions of the Gulf Coast, with scattered convective activity also forecasted in the vicinity of Dallas later that same afternoon. Now, none of that was unusual for early August in Texas. This simply showed that the crew would face conditions that airline pilots encountered almost every day throughout the summer in that region. So they likely didn't think that much about it. Take some extra fuel, be vigilant, and that's it. But as the flight then progressed and eventually passed New Orleans, the line of bad weather along the Texas-Louisiana coastline had intensified. So rather than continue on their planned arrival route, the crew requested and received a more northerly track to avoid the developing storms to the south. This was a conservative decision, but one that also added roughly 10 to 15 minutes to the flight due to the arrival sequencing near Dallas. Now, like I mentioned before, Flight 191's destination airport would be Dallas-Fort Worth International, and while it had opened only 11 years earlier, by the summer of 1985, it had already become one of the busiest airports in the country. It was built almost exactly halfway between the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth, with the sprawling airport now occupying nearly 70 square kilometers of land, and it served as a major hub for several operators, particularly Delta and the rapidly expanding American Airlines. On a typical summer afternoon, there would therefore have been a constant stream of takeoffs and landings, with controllers carefully sequencing traffic onto parallel runways, while threading aircraft around all of the thunderstorms that were an almost fixed feature of northern Texan summers. Now, the combination of intense summer heat, abundant moisture flowing inland from the Gulf of Mexico, and a typically unstable air mass had allowed towering cumulonimbus clouds to build across the region throughout this particular afternoon, and they were now becoming quite active. So by the time Flight 191 was approaching Dallas, several storm cells had formed around the airport, but they still remained scattered enough to allow arrivals and departures to continue between them with only minor delays. At 17:35 local time, the crew of Flight 191 copied the latest automatic terminal information service, ATIS, and it advised them that aircraft were landing on runway 17 left under visual flight rules with scattered clouds at 6,000 feet, a broken layer at 25,000 feet, visibility of 15 miles, light southerly winds, and thunderstorms in the vicinity of the airport. Again, a perfectly normal weather report for a Texan summer afternoon, with no signs of anything that would give the crew any particular difficulties. Now, one of the controllers initially issued a heading that would have taken Flight 191 closer to a sizable storm cell than what the captain considered to be acceptable. So he now just denied that new heading and asked the approach controller for a wider vector around the storm. After a brief exchange, the controller approved a revised route farther to the north, allowing the crew to remain clear of this particular weather. And a few moments later, the captain remarked that he was glad that they had not been sent through that mess. Now this shows without a doubt that this crew was cautious and wouldn't fly through a storm that they judged as being too big. But by that point, another cell was actually quietly developing much closer to the airport. A small rain shower had begun forming just north of runway 17 left, directly over the final approach path. Initially, it attracted little attention. On both airborne weather radar and the equipment available to controllers, it appeared relatively small, and although it continued to grow, it didn't look like the kind of violent thunderstorm that crews would normally need to avoid. As Flight 191 continued descending, the weather radar on board painted several returns ahead of it, but the radar equipment available to the crew and the controllers could only tell them so much at a time. And that was why they actually treated those two cells so differently. The larger cell appeared clearly enough on the cockpit display for the captain to reject a vector towards it and request a different route, but the much smaller shower near runway 17 left didn't look menacing in the same way. To the crew, it just looked like a rain shower that could easily be crossed in a few moments, while to the controllers it was simply an area of precipitation, and other aircraft were continuing to land through it. Now, when we're talking about things that people can and cannot see, did you know that people search sites can publish your home address, phone numbers, and even your relatives' names for anyone to find? Well, they can, and it is also perfectly legal, which is exactly what today's sponsor, Incogni, has been built to fix. Here's how it works. Once you have signed up using the link here below, you first tell Incogni what personal information you want them to scrub from the internet, and after that, their digital army will go to work, automatically scanning over 400 data broker sites for your data. When they find it, and they will, Incogni will then send removal requests on your behalf, but they don't just stop there. Incogni will then keep scanning for as long as you are with them, and even check up on the same sites that they found your info on before, because it has a habit of resurfacing a couple of months later. So it's like playing a digital game of whack-a-mole. And sure, you could try to do all of this yourself, but that would likely take hundreds of hours to do. So it's much easier and faster to leave it to the professionals, which is what I did. And as you can see, they've been quite busy. Also, with their customs removal feature, you can request your info to be taken down from specific sites if you find something. Just submit the URL via the Incogni dashboard and they will take it from there. So to start getting back in control of your digital footprint, scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot for a 60% discount on the annual plan. Just remember to use the code PILOT at checkout. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. At the time, the air traffic control radar in use at Dallas-Fort Worth couldn't distinguish the intensity of a storm cell, since it was designed primarily to depict the locations of aircraft, not to provide detailed weather information. Controllers could identify areas where precipitation was interfering with the radar returns, but what they could see couldn't reliably tell them whether a small shower was strengthening rapidly. Anyway, at approximately time 17:58, as Flight 191 descended through 9,000 feet, and while the crew on the flight deck was completing the approach checklist, Approach Control broadcasted an advisory to all aircraft on its frequency. Attention all aircraft listening. There's a little rain shower just north of the airport, and we're starting to make ILS approaches. Now this message was informative rather than cautionary, because even though visibility through the shower had deteriorated enough for arriving aircraft to transition from visual over to instrument approaches, no unusual wind conditions or turbulence had been reported. So the pilots of Flight 191 now just continued to prepare for their arrival as normal, and a few minutes later they were vectored towards the localizer for runway 17 left. Through the cockpit windows, the crew could now clearly see the developing storm almost directly ahead of them, and the first officer even commented in a joking tone, "We're gonna get our airplane washed." But no one on the flight deck actually suggested abandoning the approach. From their perspective, they were just about to fly through a brief area of rain before emerging on the other side with the runway hopefully clearly in sight, and other aircraft also seemed to confirm that assessment. Ahead of Flight 191, American Airlines Flight 351 entered the shower while on final approach, and when the controller asked whether they had the airport in sight, the crew on that aircraft just replied, "As soon as we break out of this rain shower, we will," and they then landed normally just a few minutes later. At time 18:03, the approach controller issued one final advisory, saying, "We're getting some variable winds out there due to a shower on short final there north end of DFW." The controller was getting this information from something called the Low-Level Wind Shear Alert System, or LLWAS, which had been installed at the airport just a few years earlier. It relied on a network of anemometers positioned around the airport, measuring wind speed and direction at fixed locations. A computer then continuously compared the readings from those different sensors, looking out for differences or rapid changes known as wind shear that could suddenly increase or decrease an aircraft's performance during the critical moments around takeoff and landing. But this warning on the radio about possible wind changes was the only indication that conditions near the runway might be changing now. And moments later, Flight 191 was handed over to the tower controller. When the captain switched over to the new frequency and checked in, he merrily said that they were out here in the rain, feels good. After that, the tower controller cleared them to land, and Flight 191 captured the localizer smoothly for runway 17 left, at that point less than 5 miles away from touchdown. So with the runway now directly ahead of them, the crew completed the final few steps of configuring the aircraft for landing. The landing gear was selected down, the flaps had been extended fully, and the aircraft now slowed down towards its target approach speed of 150 knots. But the weather ahead was now changing rapidly. The small rain shower that the controllers had first mentioned only a couple of minutes earlier was now developing into a much more substantial thunderstorm, directly over the short final for runway 17 left. But despite its rapid growth in intensity, the size of the cell actually remained relatively compact, which meant that the weather radar in the nose of the TriStar and the displays available to the air traffic controllers continued to suggest that it didn't present any unusual hazard. So this meant that the controllers just continued to sequence arrivals onto runway 17 left, and apart from the advisory about some variable winds that had been issued a few moments earlier, they didn't have any new weather advisories or information to pass along to the Delta flight crew. Now, it is also worth mentioning here that the L1011's onboard weather radar was not designed to specifically detect the movements of air inside of storms like this one. It could only see precipitation, allowing the pilots to identify areas of heavy rain and steer around them. In any case, just a minute ahead of Flight 191, a Learjet now flew through the storm and reported no significant difficulties. And that would have certainly led the crew of Flight 191 to believe that the storm wouldn't give them, which was a much larger aircraft, any troubles at all. But while it is tempting to assume that if another aircraft passed through the same area a minute ahead of me, I should encounter the same conditions that they did, with thunderstorms that might not always be the case. In fact, after investigators reconstructed this storm using radar data, surface observations and aircraft performance, they determined that the dynamics inside of it evolved significantly during that crucial minute. The vertical movements inside of it actually intensified rapidly, and it also expanded across the approach path, evolving into something much more dangerous. As Flight 191 now descended through approximately 1,500 feet above the ground, the growing storm filled more and more of the pilot's windshield. So, while still looking ahead, the first officer suddenly remarked, "Lightning coming out of that one, right ahead of us." Now, this was a crucial statement because that flash now confirmed that the rain shower ahead of them had actually matured into a fully grown thunderstorm, something that Delta's operating procedures advised crews to avoid whenever practical, although the meaning of the word practical was left up to the captain. At this point, the storm still only covered a relatively small area directly before the runway, and from the L-1011's cockpit, the runway itself still appeared beyond the rain, so he could clearly see it, and more importantly, the decision to continue this approach reflected the way that a lot of airline crews in the United States and beyond routinely operated at the time. You see, although pilots were expected to avoid the most intense thunderstorms whenever practical, it was still common practice to fly through areas of convective weather if it appeared manageable. And that was particularly true when the cell was very close to the runway or if other aircraft were successfully flying through it. Airline training emphasized avoiding all thunderstorms due to the hazards they posed, such as hail or extreme turbulence, but back in 1985, this training had not yet translated into real results. In fact, studies as late as 1997 showed that 90% of pilots in the United States would continue a final approach through all but the most severe thunderstorms. Basically, I guess that's similar to how today a vast majority of car drivers will exceed the speed limit. We all know that the rules say that we shouldn't, but most people do it anyway. So in that context, continuing this approach didn't appear unreasonable to anyone in the crew, so they just pressed on. And only moments later, the aircraft entered into the leading edge of the precipitation. Rain began streaming across the windshield as visibility deteriorated, although the runway environment remained intermittently visible between the Viper strokes. So the crew now continued their routine landing call-outs while monitoring the flight instruments, outside visual references and engine indications, all as their aircraft continued descending down towards the runway. By time 1805, Flight 191 had descended to approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, and at that moment they entered an area of even more intense rainfall. Outside, the runway was now increasingly obscured behind a curtain of water, while inside the cockpit, the crew remained focused on flying a stable instrument approach. The very first indication that something had changed didn't come from outside the cockpit, but instead from their own instruments. Because after entering the heaviest part of the rain, the crew suddenly noticed how the plane was starting to accelerate without any change in the thrust or pitch. Over the next few seconds, the indicated airspeed increased from its target of 150 knots to more than 160, and it then continued climbing up to a peak of 173 knots, while at the same point they started to drift above the glide slope. Having no idea what they were now about to fly into, the first officer responded as he had been trained to do by gently reducing thrust to maintain a stabilized approach, and for a few seconds it looked like it worked as the aircraft began to settle back down onto the glide slope. But right as the speed started to drop back towards the normal values, the aircraft suddenly encountered a rapidly increasing downdraft that now pushed it below the glide slope. The first officer immediately responded by raising the nose to arrest the descent, which caused the airspeed to decrease even further. At almost exactly that same moment, the captain noticed that the airspeed was falling, and he called to the first officer to "Watch your speed, and you're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is." Now everything was suddenly happening all at once. Heavy rain lashed against the windshield, the visibility fell dramatically, the aircraft was no longer holding the glide slope, and the flight instruments were changing so rapidly that neither pilot could rely on any single indication for more than just a few moments. Now, to understand exactly what was going on here, we need to take a step back and look at what had been developing beneath this seemingly ordinary Texas thunderstorm. The common understanding of a thunderstorm is a column of warm, rising air, and for much of its existence, that's exactly what a thunderstorm is. As that warm and humid air rises rapidly through the atmosphere, it carries with it enormous quantities of moisture, until the familiar towering cumulonimbus cloud begins to form with its characteristic fuzzy anvil at the top. Eventually, as that is happening, the storm reaches a point where the huge amount of rain and hail that has been forming inside of it can no longer be supported by its updraft, and as that precipitation then begins to fall, it drags with it cooler, denser air from higher altitudes, creating an intensive downdraft. And in the later stages of a storm cloud's development, this can accelerate towards the ground at astonishing speeds. But the thing is though that when this descending column of air gets really close to the ground, it has nowhere to go. So it starts spreading outward in every direction like water from a kitchen faucet hitting a plate. And this can produce extremely strong horizontal winds who can extend for several kilometers from the point of impact, which is what we now know as a microburst. By 1985, scientists already knew that microbursts existed, and much of that understanding came from the pioneering research of Dr. Ted Fujita at the University of Chicago, whose work during the previous decade had fundamentally changed the study of severe thunderstorms. He had demonstrated that these compact downdrafts were capable of producing winds comparable to those found in weak tornadoes, even though they often lasted only a few minutes and would cover an area of no more than about 4 kilometers across. His research had then convinced many meteorologists that microbursts represented a serious hazard to aviation. But quantifying that risk and translating it into practical procedures for air traffic controllers and airline crews had proved to be far more difficult. So this was a slow, ongoing process, but things were changing. By the early 1980s, NASA and the FAA had launched an intensive effort to understand exactly how dangerous microbursts could be, and they had spent years measuring these storms as they formed and collapsed. Engineers were also developing reliable ways to detect microbursts in real time, and regulators were still debating the best operational guidance. But by 1985, airline training programs still reflected an older understanding of how to deal with low-level wind shears. But as it was starting to turn out, the danger with this particular phenomenon was not simply the downdraft itself. In fact, an airliner can fly through a vertical gust without any serious difficulty. No, the real problem is that the winds inside of a microburst can change dramatically over a really short distance in a way that will seem totally unpredictable to an unexpecting crew. And in fact, researchers discovered that some microbursts could generate changes in wind speeds that could exceed 90 knots, a change so violent that not even immediate application of maximum thrust would be enough to prevent a dangerous rapid loss of altitude. And that would then of course come when the aircraft would already be very close to the ground. This work conclusively proved that under the wrong circumstances, there were atmospheric conditions capable of overwhelming the performance of even the most powerful jet airliners. So, what would happen if you flew into one of those then? Well, when an aircraft is flying towards the center of one of these collapsing columns of air, the first thing it would encounter is the outward flowing air at the leading edge of the microburst. And since this wind is blowing directly towards the aircraft, the plane would experience an increasing headwind. This would cause the airspeed to increase without any changes in engine power or pitch, exactly what Flight 191 experienced as they descended through approximately 1,000 feet. Now, as a pilot encounters this increasing headwind, the aircraft will appear to be gaining performance and possibly be pushed above the glide slope, which causes problems because not only will the approach be destabilized by this, it could also potentially overspeed the flaps, who would be configured for landing at that point. So the natural response would therefore be to reduce the thrust in order to try and reduce the speed and stabilize the approach again, which was exactly what these pilots had done. But the problem, as I'm sure that most of you have guessed by now, is that these headwinds will only last for a few seconds, and then, as the aircraft continues forward, the headwind will rapidly weaken as the airplane enters the main body of the microburst descending column of air. The loss of that headwind will now cause the airspeed to decrease, while the downdraft will push the aircraft downwards like a giant hand, causing the crew to pitch up in order to stay on the glide slope. But if the pilot at that point has already reduced the thrust from a few seconds earlier to counteract that previous headwind, the combination of that low thrust, low speed and high pitch will now quickly put the airplane into a dangerously low energy state that could potentially lead to a stall. And of course, if the pilot then tries to avoid that stall by pushing forward and reducing the angle of attack instead, that will decrease lift, which in combination with the low speed and strong downdraft will result in an even more rapid loss of altitude. But it's not over yet. At that point, as the plane starts to exit the central downdraft, it will next start to encounter the other side of the microburst, where an increasing powerful tailwind will take over. And if the pilot is already trying to power out of a low energy state, perhaps while descending rapidly with a low forward airspeed, well, then this tailwind will degrade the aircraft's performance even further and basically act as the final nail in the coffin, preventing recovery even if the pilot at that point applies full thrust and pitches up. All of this means that in only a few seconds, an airplane could go from experiencing a performance-enhancing headwind to a performance-destroying tailwind, while simultaneously being forced downward by a rapidly descending air mass. And the point here is that if the crew reacts to each one of these components individually without anticipating what will come next, the situation could quickly become unrecoverable, even for a high-performance aircraft. And crucially, as I mentioned before, this particular phenomenon would have been invisible to nearly everyone involved, including the aircraft's crew and the air traffic controller, whose radar equipment back then was designed to ensure aircraft separation, not to spot weather. And these downdrafts can appear literally from nowhere in seconds, meaning that one aircraft can pass through an area without any real issues, whilst the next can be hit by the full force of the microburst. But it should be said that the airport in this case had access to considerably more sophisticated weather information than both the flight crews and the controllers in the tower, because they had a dedicated National Weather Service meteorologist whose role it was to monitor developing storms around the airport using weather radar capable of estimating a storm's intensity with a high degree of confidence. Unlike the radar displays available to controllers or pilots, this system could distinguish between relatively weak showers and more intense thunderstorms, allowing the meteorologist to identify storms that were more likely to produce hail, heavy rain, lightning or tornadoes. But unfortunately, this was still not good enough to do something about microbursts, because they had a very different problem. By the early 1980s, researchers had already discovered that the likelihood of a microburst was only weakly related to how intense a thunderstorm appeared on a conventional weather radar. It turned out that even relatively modest-looking storms could produce violent microbursts, while much more intense cells often produced none at all. And since the weather radar available in 1985 measured only the location and intensity of precipitation, not the movement of the air inside of the storm, it lacked reliable indication that a dangerous microburst was maybe developing beneath what seemed to be an otherwise unremarkable rain shower. And if that wasn't bad enough, the weather imagery available in 1985 was transmitted from the National Weather Service with a delay of roughly 2 minutes, which was perfectly fine for tracking most thunderstorms since storm cells typically evolved quite slowly, but a microburst could develop, reach peak intensity and then begin to collapse between those 2 minutes. That's how fast this phenomenon is. And as it turns out, this wasn't the only case of unfortunate timing in this story. As Delta 191 was on approach and the storm intensified, the airport meteorologist in Dallas happened to be away from his workstation on a scheduled lunch break. But the investigators would later conclude that him being away didn't really have any bearing on the outcome itself, and that was because of that 2-minute lag in the radar pictures, because that meant that he was unlikely to have provided enough information for an effective warning anyway. So the real problem here was not the meteorologists, but instead the existing technology and procedures. Even the airport's best weather tools simply couldn't keep pace with a phenomenon that was evolving that quickly, which meant that by the time Flight 191 was facing this threat, the danger was invisible to everyone that could have made a difference. And the pilot's procedures were not strong enough to stop them from entering into the cloud. Also, remember that low-level wind shear alert system that I mentioned earlier? Well, LLWAS was also not very good at detecting microbursts because of 2 crucial shortcomings. First, it relied on widely spaced physical sensors, and since microbursts are so small, it was possible for a microburst to go undetected since it was entirely contained in the unmonitored space between two or more sensors. Secondly, and more crucially for this story, LLWAS wasn't designed to detect wind shear outside of the airport perimeter, including along the approach path where Flight 1901 currently was. So, back on board Flight 1901, the situation now continued deteriorating so fast that the crew was struggling to comprehend it. As the airplane proceeded into the microburst downdraft in a nose-high attitude with low engine thrust, the headwind now suddenly vanished. That meant that they lost 44 knots of airspeed in just 10 seconds. In response to that, the captain now called for the first officer to advance the thrust levels. Push it up! Push it way up! Way up! That's it! The first officer responded immediately, advancing all three engines to almost takeoff settings, but as he did, the aircraft very briefly encountered another increase in headwind, and the indicated airspeed, which had fallen to approximately 129 knots, recovered to around 140, while the aircraft climbed back up towards the glide slope. So to the crew, this might have looked like the worst had now passed, and from their instruments, the approach now looked reasonably recoverable. The captain had received wind shear recognition training at Delta, but it reflected the industry's limited understanding at that time. Rather than treating a wind shear encounter as a signal to immediately abandon the approach, pilots were taught to do the opposite. They were expected to continue flying a stabilized profile whenever possible by just correcting each deviation as it occurred. So this meant that if the aircraft gained speed, they should reduce thrust. If it lost speed, they should add thrust. And if it drifted above or below the glide path, they should just adjust the pitch accordingly. And the assumption was that each disturbance represented just a temporary gust, after which the airplane would naturally just return to stable air. That philosophy had developed over decades because in the vast majority of situations, it worked. Conventional wind shear was generally localized and short-lived, and transport aircraft possessed ample performance to recover from it. But what the pilots had not yet been taught was that the true nature of a microburst was not a series of separate wind changes requiring individual corrections. The intensity in wind changes, the downdraft and the rapid transition between them meant that every control input needed to anticipate what would happen next, rather than simply reacting to what had already happened. Investigators would later look at what they call the gate-to-gate wind shear across the approach path in this case, and they calculated that between entering the leading headwind and exiting into the tailwind, Flight 1901 experienced a total change of wind of roughly 72 knots. Which is a lot. So back in the cockpit, things now went from bad to worse, because now the L-1011 hit a pocket of extreme turbulence that battered the aircraft in all three axes. The headwind then fell away again, and the airspeed decreased to 120 knots, whilst at the same time a huge lateral gust sent the plane rolling so hard to the right that the first officer had to apply almost full left aileron to level the wings. Simultaneously, a 40 feet per second downdraft momentarily reversed into a 20 foot per second updraft, launching the plane upward with a vertical acceleration of 2 Gs, meaning twice the force of gravity. On board, the already high pitch angle combined with the updraft pushing the plane up from below now rapidly increased the angle of attack from 6 degrees to at least 23 degrees, well beyond the range that should ever occur in normal flight. So, sensing that his aircraft was now in serious trouble, the captain yelled out, "Hang on to this son of a bitch!" The first officer now applied maximum thrusts, perhaps trying to go around as the captain switched the flight directors to go-around mode. But then the stick shaker activated. It now loudly began vibrating the control column to warn the crew that the aircraft was now on the verge of an aerodynamic stall, so they now needed to reduce the angle of attack immediately, or the aircraft could lose its lift and fall to the ground. The first officer, again, immediately responded by lowering the nose, an instinctive and well-trained reaction that normally would reduce the angle of attack and allow the aircraft to regain speed. But since the updraft was transient, the stick shaker only lasted for about 1 second. And simulations later showed that at that moment, the aircraft was traveling at 150 knots and was accelerating with maximum power, which would have put it back on track to recover. But as the first officer now pushed forward in response to the stick shaker, the downdraft abruptly returned, together with even more tailwind as the L-1011 continued towards the far side of the microburst. This caused the pitch to fall below the horizon, and the airplane again began descending below the glide slope. So, as the downdraft reached its maximum intensity and a 30-knot tailwind started to sweep in from behind, Flight 191 found itself in a matter of seconds descending at nearly 5,000 feet per minute, while struggling to accelerate beyond 135 knots. And that was even though all three engines were now producing maximum thrust. Passing through approximately 400 feet, the ground proximity warning system suddenly came to life with a loud whoop whoop, pull up. The captain shouted, "Toga!" but the engines were already at max power here. So the warning sounded again, whoop whoop, pull up, and the first officer now pulled back with all of his might to ask for all of the performance that his aircraft could possibly give him. The nose slowly began rising once more. Passengers were pressed into their seats by nearly 2 times the force of gravity, and the descent rate started to slow, whilst the airspeed started to increase once more. And for an instant, it looked like they might just manage to recover. Outside, the rain remained so intense that visual references appeared only in brief, fleeting fragments through the windshield, and in the control tower, the controller now finally saw the Lockheed 1011 emerge from a curtain of rain, and he shouted, "Delta, go around!" But it was too late. The crew had managed to arrest most of their catastrophic sink rate, but the aircraft was still descending at around 600 feet per minute. So, at time 18:05 and 52 seconds, Flight 191 ran out of altitude, and the main landing gear touched down in an open field nearly 2 miles short of runway 17 left. But this wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The enormous Lockheed widebody now skipped across the field and briefly became airborne again, continuing towards the airport perimeter, now at a ground speed of approximately 216 knots due to that tailwind, which was much faster than a normal landing. The engines also remained at maximum power as the aircraft surged forward only a few feet above the ground, with its pilots cursing as they tried to get their plane back under control, unable to properly slow it down or to get it to climb away. Ahead lay Texas State Highway 114, one of the busiest roads serving the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where the drivers making their evening commute now had only seconds to react as the widebody airliner burst out from the wall of rain directly in front of them. Still airborne, but flying very low, Flight 191 now crossed the western lanes of the highway before its left engine struck a passing car, killing the driver instantly. This impact tore pieces from both the engine and the aircraft as it continued across the highway, clipping light posts and narrowly missing other vehicles, before finally reaching an open field on the opposite side. The left engine, now badly damaged by the collision, soon dug into the soft ground and was torn from its pylon, and as it separated, much of the left wing failed with it, releasing thousands of liters of fuel that ignited almost immediately. This also caused the aircraft to now yaw violently to the left, shedding its landing gear, wing structure and sections of the tail as it continued sliding across the field at tremendous speed, and just beyond the highway stood 2 large airport water tanks. With hardly any control remaining, Flight 191 now slammed into one of those tanks at a speed of roughly 200 knots, and that impact destroyed the forward fuselage almost instantly, while the tail section separated and was thrown hundreds of meters across the airport grounds. Fuel, wreckage and water from the ruptured tank now erupted across a vast debris field as fire engulfed much of what remained of the aircraft. From the control tower, the controllers watched helplessly as the entire sequence unfolded in front of them. The crash alarm was activated immediately and airport rescue vehicles began racing towards the scene, with the first firefighting units reaching the wreckage in less than a minute. And when they did, they encountered an enormous debris field stretching from the highway all the way to the destroyed water tank. Burning fuel, shattered aircraft structure and injured survivors were scattered across the area as crews began pulling passengers from the wreckage wherever they could reach them. But even then, the storm that had started all of this wasn't finished. The same microburst that had brought down Flight 191 now continued moving slowly across the airport, reaching the crash site only minutes later. So firefighters who had just begun the rescue operations now suddenly found themselves working in torrential rain, frequent lightning and wind gusts approaching 40 knots as they struggled to extinguish the fires and search for survivors. Rescue crews continued working throughout the evening, searching the shattered wreckage for survivors, and by the time the immediate rescue operation had concluded, 135 people had been killed, including 134 aboard the aircraft and the driver of the car that had been struck on Highway 114. 28 occupants of the aircraft survived the initial impact, all of them from the largely intact tail section, with many suffering severe burns and traumatic injuries. And in the weeks that followed, 2 of those survivors also succumbed to their injuries, bringing the total death toll up to 137. In the end, investigators would conclude that neither the aircraft nor its crew had suffered any mechanical failures capable of explaining what had happened. Instead, they found themselves investigating something that the aviation industry was only beginning to understand. The determination that Flight 191 was brought down by a microburst carried significance far beyond the accident itself, as it became the clearest real-world confirmation of findings that the industry and researchers had built but had not yet become common wisdom in the airlines and among its crews. For instance, the industry realized that even though low-level wind shear alert systems represented an important technological advance for the time, they were largely insufficient. And that accelerated the development and deployment of Terminal Doppler Weather Radars, or TDWR. This technology differed fundamentally from conventional weather radars by measuring the motion of precipitation rather than simply displaying where rain was and wasn't falling. And by identifying the characteristic diverging wind patterns produced by a developing microburst, TDWR could automatically alert controllers before an arriving aircraft actually encountered these hazardous winds. Those advances eventually also reached the flight deck, where modern transport aircraft are equipped with predictive wind shear radar that also uses Doppler technology to examine the atmosphere ahead of the airplane rather than just simply mapping precipitation. And this means that instead of discovering a microburst only after the aircraft's performance begins changing, crews will now receive unmistakable warnings such as wind shear ahead or go around, wind shear ahead, while they are still far enough away from this phenomenon to actually abandon the approach. This accident also transformed the way that airline pilots are trained, because today airline crews encountering wind shear during both takeoff and landing are trained to immediately apply maximum available thrust, establish a predetermined escape pitch attitude, and then follow predetermined wind shear escape maneuvers, which are often programmed into our flight directors, and those maneuvers has to be followed until we are out of the wind shear, no matter what type of procedure that we were flying before. The objective with this is to extract every possible bit of performance from the aircraft until it has completely escaped the wind shear and we can regain safe flight. Now, Delta Flight 191 remains one of the most defining weather accidents in aviation history, not because it revealed the existence of microbursts, but because it forced the aviation community to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and operational practice. So, every time a controller now issues a microburst warning, every time an airliner receives a predictive wind shear alert before entering a storm, and every time a crew instinctively advances the thrust levels to maximum power and flies a wind shear escape maneuver, they are relying on lessons written in the aftermath of Delta Airlines Flight 191. Now, this episode was another collaborative effort by my team and I, who now includes over 15 full-time working wonderful people. And if you want to support what we do and get to ask questions directly to me, as well as getting other perks and previews, well then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I would love to see you there in my next Zoom hangout. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.